Okay, everyone, we're going to look at the 5 Pieces for String Quartet by Anton Webern, Opus 5. We're going to be looking at the first of the 5 pieces. If we look at bar number 1, this piece really starts off very quickly. An explosion happens at the very opening of the piece. The loudest moments probably in the entire set of 5 pieces, maybe, with the exception of the last little moments of piece number 3. But nonetheless, we're going to be doing a little bit of set theory work here. And in this piece, the composer deals with both 4 and 3 note sets. Now, if we look at this opening salvo, if you may, or maybe a sortie, this enormous explosion, a very shocking opening of the piece. We have pizzicato, arco, con legno, all of these different types of articulations that are occurring all at the same time. Now, if we gather this material as one idea, which really it is when you get down to it, let's see what we end up with. Well, we have this octave going between the, or actually 2 octaves between the second violin and cello. We have the note C, and that goes to C sharp. Then in the first violin, we have F and E, and that's also in the viola, an octave lower. We have F and E, and I'll put it in that order like this. And then this is just repeated. It's struck many times. We have the same pitches, C sharps, F, C, and then the E, and it all kind of comes together right there at that moment. This big collection of the 4 notes. So if we figure out what this set is, we could start with C, C, C sharp, E, and F. We have a 0, 1, 4, 5. And that's not so hard. But let's see, I always say, well, what happens if you turn it the other way around? Well, in this case, if we try F, E, C sharp, and C, you'll notice that we once again have 0, 1, 4, and 5. And when you have a set of notes that has more than one normal form, we're going to call that a symmetrical set. And that's going to be a big portion of this piece, is the idea of using symmetrical sets throughout. If we continue on in the piece here a little bit, we'll notice that let's just take a look at the first violin for a moment. It's this very rapid changing line, again, just a couple seconds after the piece begins. And if we break this down into 3 note segments, like this, etc., we end up with F sharp, D sharp, G, which we could spell G, F sharp, and D sharp, 0, 1, and 4. And then the next few notes, we have G sharp, E, and A. So G sharp, E, and A. And actually, if we spell it A, G sharp, E, doing it that way, we end up with 0, 1, 5. And if we go to the next group of 3 notes, we have B flat, G, F sharp, B flat, G, and F sharp. And if we spell it as F sharp, G, and B flat, we end up with 0, 1, 4. And we see that there's a pattern that's beginning. That's an alternation between 0, 1, 4 and 0, 1, 5 as we go on through this passage. Well, this is an interesting thing that's happening. You notice that, well, this opening set was 0, 1, 4, 5, and now we have these 0, 1, 4s and 0, 1, 5s. That's another idea. We can call them subsets. One more thing about this opening of the piece that I think is really important for us to examine, now that we have a new idea, the idea of the symmetrical set, and also the idea of subsets either coming together to create a larger idea or a larger idea broken down into smaller ideas, let's take a look at the actual pitch content itself from the very beginning of the piece. And if you count the notes up, we start with C and C sharp, F and E. I'll spell E and F. And then we go a little bit further on. We have, of course, those few notes going on. Let's go back to the cello. We have a B. I'm going to put that over here. and then D and A flat in the viola. So we have a D and A flat. You see what's happening. The whole chromatic scale is starting to fill in at this point. We'll continue going on. We have F sharp in the first violin, also with D sharp, G in the first violin again, and then some of the notes repeat even though they're spelled differently, and finally we have an A natural, and then finally a B flat. Well, that's really interesting. In this first section of the piece, by the time we get to the end of bar 2, Webern has articulated every single note out of the chromatic scale. In set theory, we call that the aggregate. The aggregate is the total collection of all chromatic notes. And in some music by set theory composers, they use the aggregate to separate sections from one another, to define portions of the piece, and sometimes not. So when you're analyzing a piece of music and you find the aggregate, you should always look to see if the aggregate does occur. See if it's structural. See if the composer is thinking about that in the long term, meaning we see the aggregate returning within the course of the composition. If not, again, when dealing with set theory, some of the things that we can analyze might be considered just coincidental. So if you see something systematic, you see something repeat, then you can consider it perhaps functional. We get a little bit of insight into the compositional process. If we look at the fourth piece of the 5 pieces for string quartet, we'll notice that there are some elements that we've examined before that are used in the compositional process. For example, if you look at the opening line, and again, please listen to the piece before we examine it, because that's a very important part of this whole process, is connecting what you're hearing with what we're seeing. So let's see what we have. We have the notes B, C, E, and F. B, C, E, and F. And that is 0, 1, 5, 6. But interestingly enough, take a look at what happens if we spell it, you go it the other way. F, E, C, and B, 0, 1, 5, and 6 again. So we have another symmetrical set. And it's interesting that here it's played almost as a sonority, just this shimmering, very high, quiet, almost like insect-like line. And then he takes that collection of pitches and then later on, just a couple of bars later, stretches it out into a melody. About midway through the piece, there's this, everything just kind of stops here. And then we have this beautiful, very melancholy line that is played in the first violin. If you notice here in the cello, we have an artificial harmonic. That's the diamond note, meaning we don't actually hear that note, so we can't consider it as part of any set. The idea of an artificial harmonic in string playing, for example, when we have a perfect fourth, as we have here with the E and the A is touched very lightly, and what it does is you put a finger on the E, and what it does is it shoots this note up 2 octaves. So actually, even though it's played down here, because of the artificial harmonic, the note we hear is over there. So it's this very wispy sound between the second violin and the cello. And in between this, we have the viola line. This is what I really wanted us to look at, because if you take a look at this ostinato figure, Webern really liked these ostinato figures. We saw that in the third movement in the cello, in different places, the idea of just this repeating thing. Take a look at the pitches that you have. You have G flat, B flat, and D. So G flat, B flat, and D. And if you figure out what the set is for this, well, we'll see that G flat to B flat is 4, so it's 0, 4. And G flat to D is 8, so we have 0, 4, 8. But if we try it in a different rotation, for example, B flat, D, G flat, B flat, D, G flat, it's also 0, 4, 8. And if we try D, G flat, B flat, it's 0, 4, 8. And if you try it the other way around, D, B flat, G flat, they're all 0, 4, 8s. This is another example of a symmetrical set. And we see that he uses this in other places in the piece as well.